Good evening. It's December 12th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you to our weekly webcast from LaRouchePack.com. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Dennis Small from Executive Intelligence Review and Benjamin Denniston from the LaRouche Pack Scientific Basement Team. And the three of us have been in discussion with Mr. LaRouche over the last 24 hours. So the presentation you hear tonight will directly reflect our discussions with Mr. LaRouche. Now, I would like to begin with our institutional question for the evening, which reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, chaired by Senator Dianne Feinstein, released the long-awaited 500-page unclassified version of its 6,000-page investigation into the CIA's rendition and torture program during the Bush-Cheney period. Please give us your assessment of the significance of the release of this report, its contents, and the political implications of the release of the document going forward. And I would like to ask Dennis Small to come to the podium to deliver Mr. LaRouche's response.
Well, we're at the end of an era and the beginning of a new one if, to paraphrase Ben Franklin, we can achieve it and keep it. Mr. LaRouche said that the enemy is taking a real beating, and this is a true moment of opportunity. What the Feinstein revelations on CIA torture portend is the end of the entire post-9/11 dynamic in which the United States, for the entire 14 years of this 21st century, under 2 Bush administrations and 2 Obama administrations, has been marshaled by the British Empire as an aggressive imperial force up to and including threatening thermonuclear war against Russia and China today. At the same time, it was being converted into a garrison national security state under the Nazi ideology of the likes of Dick Cheney and other followers of Leo Strauss, condoning everything from torture to drone murders and worse. That was the situation until this week. Mr. LaRouche said that the Republicans are now gearing up to try to push Jeb Bush as the next president of the United States, and that would doom the United States to bankruptcy or worse. What Senator Dianne Feinstein did, Mr. LaRouche stressed, is, along with the backing of important institutional forces who helped her to stand up to the kind of pressure she was getting both from the Bush League and also from the Obama administration, what she did, Mr. LaRouche said, is very, very good. It may misfire, but I think it will go someplace, he said. It won't be so easy to ram through more of the Bush League as a consequence of what was revealed here. And that Bush League includes not just Jeb Bush, but also grandfather Prescott Bush's financing of Hitler's rise to power, the first president, George H.W. Bush, and then W himself. Now, this is going to be especially the case now that the average American is aware of what is going on around the torture question with the Feinstein revelations, and the average American has no stomach for anything like this. And the average American, starting with those watching this television presentation, this webcast today, are going to respond even more strongly as they learn the full story of what's behind the CIA torture story, as we will present it today. Now, it's important to remember what 9/11 actually was when we refer to the end of the post-9/11 period. What 9/11 was an attack by the British monarchy using Saudi cutouts, which was intended to subject the United States to a Dick Cheney-led dictatorship under the nominal presidency of cokehead George W. Bush, while using the incident to also justify wars of aggression and regime change around the world. The Saudi role in particular is documented in the infamous 28 pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11, which Bush classified so that it would hopefully never see the light of day, he thought, in order to protect his role and his allies, and which the Obama administration has continued to maintain classified as well, until this week. Now, the post-9/11 dictatorship and imperial wars, Mr. LaRouche stressed, excuse me, were designed to enforce a collapsing transatlantic financial system, including Wall Street, which the Bush League has always represented. The entire Wall Street policy is now in the process of disintegration, Mr. LaRouche said. So what this means is that we're now also facing what can be called a Glass-Steagall moment. As with Senator Feinstein's courageous stand, significant chunks of the Democratic Party have also revolted against the Bush League and Obama's alliance with Wall Street, as was seen in full technicolor in yesterday's House vote on the omnibus budget bill. A gathering army is coming to realize that the only way to stop war and stop the annihilation of the American economy is with a radical change in course. So, as Mr. LaRouche has repeatedly stressed, we must urgently remove Obama from office, and we must reorganize the Democratic Party on traditional American system lines. We must create a future, and we can do that after Hillary Clinton's likely removal of herself from the candidacy. That's a required step so that Bill Clinton, who, after having been president 2 times, may not run again, but he should, Mr. LaRouche said, and probably will, help orchestrate the new candidacy. He should be in, a leader on the case, and a spokesman for the new presidency that the country requires at this time. The issue underlying all of this, Mr. LaRouche said, is that of Wall Street and how close we are to a blowout. You can't evade the issue of Alexander Hamilton and his system. People think they're going to save something in terms of money by not bringing that up, by pretending it's just not there, but that's precisely what will kill them. It's understandable, they're terrified, but if they stick to that, it's going to kill them. So we have to dump Wall Street and return to Hamilton, which is exactly the prospect offered to the United States by joining the BRICS nations in the creation of a new international order. This week now, we have the possibility of ending the post-9/11 period and of taking advantage of this Glass-Steagall moment which is now before us.
Now, I would like to show you the first couple of minutes of Senator Feinstein's speech on the floor of the Senate on December 9th, which was the day that this torture report was released. I'd encourage people to watch the entire speech, but I think that this first excerpt will give you a good sense of the quality of what Feinstein did.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, I want to thank the leader for his words and for his support. They are extraordinarily welcomed and appreciated. Today, a 500-page executive summary of the Senate Intelligence Committee's 5.5-year review of the CIA's detention and interrogation program, which was conducted between 2002 and 2009, is being released publicly. The executive summary, which is going out today, is backed by a 6,700-page classified and unredacted report with 38,000 footnotes, which can be released, if necessary, at a later time. The report released today examines the CIA's secret overseas detention of at least 119 individuals and the use of coercive interrogation techniques, in some cases amounting to torture. Over the past couple of weeks, I've gone through a great deal of introspection about whether to delay the release of this report to a later time. This clearly is a period of turmoil and instability in many parts of the world. Unfortunately, that's going to continue for the foreseeable future, whether this report is released or not. There are those who will seize upon the report and say, see what the Americans did, and they will try to use it to justify evil actions or incite more violence. We can't prevent that, but history will judge us by our commitment to a just society governed by law and the willingness to face an ugly truth and say never again.
Now, I encourage you to watch this speech in full, but what you just heard Senator Feinstein end with here, when she said, history will judge us by our commitment to a just society governed by law and the willingness to face an ugly truth and say never again, I think gets directly at the core of the issue here. After the Nuremberg trials, when the Nazi war criminals were being tried and hung, what did we say? Never again. The full extent of the evil that the Nazis represented had to be exposed and put on full display for the entire world to see in order to ensure that this type of evil never happened again. So today, this torture program, which is now being exposed by the Feinstein report in its full and horrifying detail, was itself nothing but a purely Nazi program put in practice by a purely Nazi administration. And Feinstein is saying the same thing. We must show the world the evil that was committed in order to ensure that this type of evil occurs never again. And I think that's a phrase which also applies perfectly to Jeb Bush or any other Bush League candidate for president of the United States. President Bush, never again. What the Bush-Cheney administration represented was the attempt to transform the United States from a constitutional republic into a fascist dictatorship in the aftermath of 9/11. And this is largely what has occurred in the intervening 13 years, both in terms of the internal police state policies, including the domestic surveillance of the NSA, and in terms of the permanent warfare policies abroad. We've been in a constant state of war for the entirety of this century to date. However, what occurred following September 11th did not originate in the events of September 11th. This is something that Lyndon LaRouche warned about explicitly 9 months prior to the attacks that occurred on September 11th, warning that the incoming Bush administration would use a Reichstag-fire-type event to impose dictatorial emergency rule on the United States. Let me show you a clip from a webcast that Mr. LaRouche delivered on January 3rd, 2001, 9 months before 9/11.
Not a government. You're going to have something like a Nazi regime. What you're going to get with a frustrated Bush administration, it is determined to prevent itself from being opposed its will. You're going to get crisis management, where members of the special warfare types of the secret government, the secret police teams and so forth, will set off provocations which will be used to bring about dictatorial powers into motion in the name of crisis management. You will have small wars set off in various parts of the world, which the Bush administration will respond to with crisis management methods of provocation. That's what you'll get. And that's what the problem is. And you have to face that.
Nine months of attacks occurred, and everything that Mr. LaRouche warned about happened. How did Mr. LaRouche know? It wasn't because he had some sort of secret information or some sort of inside knowledge or something like that. The Nazi character of the Bush administration was plain for anyone to see if they cared to look. It was pre-programmed into the administration long before Bush was even selected to become President of the United States. The most immediate antecedent for this is what should be called the Neocon Manifesto, or the Roadmap to a New British American Empire, or the statement of the founding principles which set up the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC. One of the original founding members of PNAC was none other than Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother, along with a whole retinue of other neocons who would later come to comprise practically the entirety of the Bush-Cheney administration. And who was the original co-founder of PNAC? Mr. Robert Kagan, also known as Mr. Victoria Nuland. Now, what did this manifesto say? It asserted that in the aftermath of the Cold War, this was released in 1997, American foreign policy must be to do everything possible to maintain the hegemony of the United States and its leading ally, the United Kingdom, and to prevent the rise of Russia, of China, or of any other nation that might challenge this hegemony. It asserted, quote, "The history of the 20th century should have taught us that it is important to shape circumstances before crises emerge and to meet threats before they become dire." Now, what do they mean by shape circumstances before crises emerge? Well, long before September 11th ever happened, what were the founders of PNAC arguing for? Already in 1998, PNAC representatives were openly campaigning for regime change against Saddam Hussein on the premise that he possessed weapons of mass destruction which he was about to unleash against the United States. Sound familiar? This was the big lie that Bush, Cheney, and Tony Blair used to bomb Iraq 5 years later in 2003, while also claiming that Saddam was somehow connected with the attacks on 9/11. Also a lie. Here's another chilling example. In 2000, PNAC authored another report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, which called for preserving Anglo-American preeminence through a massive military buildup in order to, quote, deter the rise of a new great power competitor, calling specifically for the military encirclement of China. The report also called for regime change in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and pretty much any other state in the region that was deemed hostile to Anglo-American interests. And finally, it called for, quote, consolidating the victory of the Cold War in Europe by the creation of a Europe whole and free from the Baltic to the Black Sea, i.e. running colored revolutions on Russia's border, including in Ukraine. Remember, this is Robert Kagan writing this, husband of Victoria Nuland. You kind of have to wonder if these were actually their wedding vows. Do you, Victoria, take Robert to be your lawfully wedded husband? And she responds, I coo. I should also note that Robert Kagan has explicitly attacked John Quincy Adams, who famously said, America goes not in search of monsters to destroy. She is a well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is a champion and vindicator only of her own. Kagan stated, but why not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy? Because America has the power to contain or destroy many of the world's monsters. A policy of sitting on a hill and leading by example becomes, in practice, a policy of cowardice and dishonor. Hence, an imperial policy of regime change and perpetual war. Now, the most chilling thing about this 2000 report, which was written a full year before September 11th, is that it admits that such a military buildup to encircle Russia and China would take a very long time to accomplish under ordinary peacetime circumstances, absent, quote, some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, unquote. So, should it be a surprise that this apparatus was in place and ready to go the minute that September 11th occurred, ready to launch wars, domestic surveillance, police state tactics, and torture? So as you read this Feinstein report, it's necessary to keep all of this in the back of your head and remember that the premise for this entire torture program has this as its background. If Bush and Cheney were serious about getting to the root of who did 9/11 and preventing another attack from occurring, why did they classify the 28 pages of the 9/11 Joint Inquiry Report, which documented the Saudi sponsorship of the 9/11 attacks under the then ambassador to Washington, Prince Bandar, also known as Bandar Bush? Why did Tony Blair shut down the investigation into the BAE Al-Yamama deal, which would have exposed the British role in facilitating the Saudi 9/11 operation? Why is Obama continuing to cover up the 28 pages, not to mention working directly with the Saudis in the Middle East to arm and train a whole new batch of jihadi terrorists? Is this not aiding and abetting the sworn enemies of the United States who attacked us on 9/11 and who intend to do it again? Now, also, when you read this Feinstein report, ask yourself this: what sort of character did these people have to condone such bestial and inhuman torture policies? This comes out very clearly in an interview that none other than Dick Cheney did yesterday on Fox News, in which he declared that the Feinstein report was, quote, full of crap, and said absolutely remorselessly, with a sneer on his face, I was strongly supportive of this program. We were perfectly justified in doing it, and I'd do it again in a minute. Now, what else Cheney said, I think, is also very telling, in which he says he, quote, strongly believes that the ends justified the means. Now, this happens to be an explicit statement of the fascist ideology of Leo Strauss, who was the intellectual mentor of the entire neocon apparatus. LaRouche documented this very thoroughly in our now famous, or infamous, depending on who you are, Children of Satan book in 2004. And PNAC really was an open conspiracy of this grouping of so-called Straussians who had planted themselves deeply within the institutions of the United States government and were waiting for the moment to put their fascist ideas into action. And that moment occurred on September 11th, 2001. So, who was Leo Strauss? Leo Strauss was a protege of the crown jurist of the Nazi Third Reich, Carl Schmitt. What both Strauss and Schmitt believed was quite literally that the ends justify the means, that an elite must rule society using what they called the noble lie, to pacify and to control what they believed were a stupid population who were unable of governing themselves. Schmitt and Strauss both based their philosophy on the belief that man is inherently evil, and that Hobbes was right when he described the world as a war of each against all. For example, Leo Strauss wrote a letter to his mentor, Carl Schmitt, in September of 1932, right before Hitler's ascent to power, in which he said the following: "The ultimate foundation of right is the principle of the natural evil of man. Because man is by nature evil, he therefore needs dominion. But dominion can be established, that is, men can be unified only in unity against other men. So, clearly, a Hobbesian, bestial idea of the nature of man. Now, Schmidt believed that the Treaty of Westphalia had been nullified by World War I, and therefore the only international law that applied was that of the struggle for the preservation of power of one state against another. Sound familiar? Let me read that quote from the 2000 PNAC report again. The goal of American post-Cold War foreign policy must be, quote, to deter the rise of a new great power competitor, China, Russia, and so forth. And this ends justifies all the means, including regime change, coup d'etat, colored revolution, etc., even preemptive nuclear war. This was the argument that was used to justify the war in Iraq, which was premised on Saddam Hussein's so-called weapons of mass destruction, which Cheney knew all along to be one big lie, as did Tony Blair. Now, just briefly, to understand why George W. Bush was the perfect vehicle for this attempted Nazi coup in 2001, and why we can't let Jeb get anywhere close to the presidency now, one only needs to look at a brief history of the Bush family. The Bush family, or better said, the Bush dynasty, represents the legacy of fascism in the United States going all the way back to before Hitler's rise to power. Prescott Bush, who was the grandfather of George W. Bush, as well as Jeb Bush, was the son of George Herbert Walker, who immediately after World War I set up a Wall Street-based bank called Harriman and Company. He hired his son-in-law, Prescott Bush, to set up a subsidiary called UBC, Union Banking Corporation. What was this bank for? The only reason for UBC to exist was to manage Fritz Thysson's business accounts inside the United States. Quite literally. Thyssen was the sole client and depositor of Union Banking Corporation. Who was Fritz Thyssen? Well, I think the title of his autobiography says it all. I paid Hitler. Now, not to go into the details, but finally, in 1942, Franklin Roosevelt launched an investigation of UBC and seized the accounts of Prescott Bush under the Trading with the Enemy Act, as well as a number of other subsidiary companies that were owned by Prescott Bush. Now, you can ask the question, weren't the Bush family merely shrewd businessmen making money off of wartime profiteering? Or was there some sort of ideological affinity for what Hitler represented? Well, it's very well known that George Herbert Walker and his partner Harriman were early proponents of eugenics inside the United States, what would later become Hitler's genocidal so-called race science. And did this end after the defeat of Hitler? Absolutely not. It merely transformed into the more benign sounding but equally evil population control, population reduction movement. Prescott Bush was a pioneer in this in the United States. His son, George H.W. Bush, went on as a congressman to chair the Republican Task Force on Earth Resources and Population. George H.W. Bush, during his time as the chair of this task force, issued a statement in which he said, "It is almost self-evident that the greater the human population, the greater the demands for natural resources. How many is too many people? Many believe that our current environmental problems indicate that the optimum level has been surpassed." And this was in the 1970s. Sound like Prince Philip to you? It should be no surprise, I think, that George H.W. Bush was awarded an honorary knighthood by the British Queen. And it should also be no surprise that this linkage between population growth and raw materials ultimately became the premise of the now infamous National Security Study Memorandum 200, which called for regime change in countries around the world. So after George Bush was the director of the CIA, and after he was the vice president under Reagan, he became the president for one term from 88 to 92. And who did he appoint as his Secretary of Defense? None other than Dick Cheney. And when Bush lost his second term to Bill Clinton, this Cheney crowd went underground and formed itself into what became PNAC, whose manifesto, again, was written by Robert Kagan and signed by none other than Jeb Bush, who would now have you believe that he is the kinder, gentler, more moderate member of the Bush family. Right. So I think we need to embrace this moment, as Dennis laid it out in the beginning of our broadcast, with this release of the Feinstein report, as Mr. LaRouche said, where we've reached the end of one era, the 9/11 era, and the potential beginning of a new one. And specifically, as Dianne Feinstein said, we have looked evil in the face, and we have declared never again. And that absolutely applies to the Bushes. However, it's our responsibility now to define what the new era must be. How will we create a new presidency? How will we create a new paradigm, a new dynamic of optimism to give the American people real leadership and a real mission orientation, and to sweep the United States into this new international order that's now being created by the BRICS? So I'd like Dennis Small to come back to the podium to discuss this.
That's exactly the sense in which this is indeed a Glass-Steagall moment, because the entire paradigm has been called into question. We've reached the limit, both in terms of the extreme danger of an immediate nuclear war being launched by this crowd against Russia and China, and we've also reached the absolute limit of the disintegration of the entire transatlantic financial system, including the collapse of the United States economy. And this double reality has clearly begun to dawn on some people. There was yesterday, last night, a very important vote taken in the House of Representatives of the United States. In this vote, what happened was that there was a 219 to 206 vote, which did finally approve the omnibus budget bill. And this approved bill included the repeal of Section 716 of the Dodd-Frank bill. This is the so-called swaps push-out rule. Now, this Section 716 is the one tiny part of Dodd-Frank, all 1,000+ pages, which somehow survived and said that the government should not back up a certain category of derivatives trading that the banks were engaged in. That has now been revoked. It's now totally clear sailing. It's very interesting that the existence of that one tiny clause in these thousands of pages was used by many congressmen and others to justify the fact that they would not support Glass-Steagall. They said, well, no, we don't need to do that because, after all, Dodd-Frank does have 716 in it. Well, Dodd-Frank doesn't even have 716 in it anymore. And what happened, both by the way it was done and the content of the maneuvering, of the actual policy, is that a revolt occurred among Democrats in particular in the House of Representatives that threatened passage of this bill up till the very last minute. Senator Elizabeth Warren played an extremely important role in organizing members, not just across the aisle, but in the House of Representatives, which is not commonly done by any means, to not allow this revocation of this to pass. Because the issue, she said, and many agreed with her, was Wall Street. Who runs the show? Are we going to allow this Wall Street crowd, which, remember, is who actually runs Bush, are we going to allow them to continue with their destructive derivatives trading until the entire country is destroyed? Now, what ultimately led to the vote of approval of this removal of this Section 716 was the fact that the House members were whipped. That's the phrase that's used for pressured and organized to vote a certain kind of way. But in this case, I think it could possibly be taken literally as well, especially given Dick Cheney's influence over policies. After all, whipping and waterboarding, not a big difference. But they were whipped into line by phone calls from the following people, which I'm going to cite in order of influence. First, Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan. Jamie Dimon. Secondly, Barack Obama, placed into the presidency by the same Wall Street interests. Then Dennis McDonough, chief of staff of the White House, and also Vice President Biden. It should be noted that McDonough was also one of the people who was deployed out to talk to Senator Feinstein to try to convince her in the weeks prior to the release of the CIA report that it should not be released, and that is one of the pressures she stood up to. Now, what happened around this whole thing is that you had Obama and Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan jointly pressuring the House of Representatives to make sure that the banks were given absolutely free rein in the derivatives. And this led to a big ruckus, summarized adequately, I think, by Congressman Maxine Waters of California, who said the following: "It is just very strange that the two of them, Obama and Dimon, would be working for the support of this bill." And she was asked, was this an Obama sellout to Wall Street? And she said, "That's not for me to determine. I know that the president was whipping. I know that Jamie Dimon was whipping and calling directly into members' offices. And that's odd. That's an odd combination." Marcy Kaptur, Congresswoman from Ohio, Democrat from Ohio, one of the sponsors of the Glass-Steagall resolution before the House of Representatives, said, "I'd like to know who's really behind this. Who has enough power to try and bring this before this committee? I have some imaginations of who that might be." And I'm sure she does, and so do we. The point here, what's actually on the table, as increasing numbers of influentials, including in the Democratic Party, are coming to realize, that the financial system of the entire Western world is completely, totally blown out. The latest drop in oil prices has simply created a new fuse onto a gigantic $2 quadrillion bomb. And that fuse is because the lowering of the price of the oil has created a problem with the $500 billion or so speculative bubble built up around fracking and so on. Because if the price drops to a certain point, it's not just that fracking becomes unprofitable, but the whole bubble built on it, like in the case of the subprime mortgages, also goes bust as well. But that's just one aspect of the whole thing. The real problem, as can be seen in the graphic, which will be on your screen momentarily, which many of you have seen from us before in previous broadcasts, the problem is that there are currently approximately $2 quadrillion in total derivatives. What happened was that with the end of Glass-Steagall in 1999, and take note of the date, the end of Glass-Steagall in 1999 was just immediately before, about 2 years before, the 2001 9/11 case, which was the other part of the paradigm shift which we've been discussing here. So what happened with 1999, the end of Glass-Steagall, the bubble grew rapidly, as you can see on the graph, from about $260 trillion total to 1.4 quadrillion at the time of the 2008 blowout. That's a 5-fold increase over that period of time, about 10 years. Now, what happened after that was about $9 trillion in quantitative easing and funny money printed in the transatlantic system, the US, the UK, and Europe, to try to bail out the bubble. And especially in the last 2 years, 2013 and 14, there has been a dramatic increase again in this whole cancerous speculative bubble. And over the last 2 years, it grew from about 1.5 quadrillion to 2 quadrillion today. That is a 33% rise in just 2 years. Now, what was Dodd-Frank? Let's speak about this. Dodd-Frank was effectively Wall Street's survival kit for the financial cancer. That's what it was. It established the premises of bailing in In other words, whose money would be stolen to try to keep this incredible bubble afloat, and who would be bailed out. And what Dodd-Frank established is that the 2 quadrillion, the cancer, would be bailed out. Who gets bailed in? Who has to pay for it? You. Along with 6 billion other people, human beings, who are considered excess population by the Bush League, the Obama policies, and exactly this Nazi ideology which Matt was referring to previously. Now, if you care to do the calculation, that comes to approximately $300,000 per corpse that these people would care to eliminate for their purposes. But the bottom line is that none of this will work. Now, I think you've seen enough of that graphic. You've got an idea of what the problem there is. Russia and China know it. They know, for one, that military nuclear war is being actively threatened against them. Most recently this week, the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Gerasimov, once again reiterated the Russian view, and he said, steps are being taken to implement specific measures to weaken Russia's strategic nuclear force. And he went on to denounce the ballistic missile defense system and the various provocations coming from the Obama administration and NATO. That has been said before by the Russians. What was most interesting about what he did in this case is where he said it and how he said it. He summoned to his meeting and spoke before 70 foreign military attaches posted to Moscow, representing 50 countries. He called in the military representatives of 50 countries and told them, gentlemen, this is not going to be accepted. So they're really very clear on the military aspect of nuclear war. But the Russians are also very clear that what is going on the financial front is financial nuclear war, threatened against them in the world. And it was stated explicitly by Wolfgang Munchau, writing in July of this year in the Financial Times, where he said, well, we can bring Russia to its knees in a week. How? We expel them from the international interbank transaction system known as the SWIFT system. And he said we should do this because, quote, payment systems are the nuclear bombs of the financial war, close quote. 2 months later, the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia was in China discussing how to build their own system of interbank clearances to do without SWIFT. And he emerged from those meetings to say, yes, we have discussed this and we have improved this idea. Over the course of this week, Russian authorities announced that they were carrying out financial tests of the various banks involved, and they will have their own system up and running by May 2015. Why? Because as was stated by the head of VTB Bank, which is the number 2 bank in Russia, and this gentleman is also a personal friend of Vladimir Putin's, his name is Andrei Kostin, what he said is, if they throw us out of SWIFT, it is a bright red line. In my personal opinion, it would mean war if this type of sanction were introduced. So they're building a new financial architecture with the Chinese and with the other countries of the BRICS. Now, all of this should also be a very bright red line for the United States as well. And I think that there are some people in Congress who have realized that that is in fact the case. We need a new financial architecture of the sort that Bill Clinton was starting to discuss precisely at the point where he was Watergated with the Lewinsky affair. We need a complete, total Hamiltonian reform of this system. And we have to do this because the physical economy of the United States and of the entire transatlantic sector is being annihilated. It's not just that monetary values are at stake here. The physical economy is being destroyed. Unemployment throughout Europe, youth unemployment is hitting 60%. In the United States, youth unemployment, real youth unemployment, is over 30% in 40 states in the United States. So you've got a situation which is completely out of control. Was previously 30, rising towards 40 states. That's where we're headed. Pensions are being wiped out. There's a water crisis which is making the entire west of the United States unlivable because the necessary investments in science and technology and infrastructure are not occurring, will not occur, cannot occur under this system. We must return to the policies of Hamilton. As LaRouche said in the mention that I made at the outset of this program, the issue is Hamilton's policies against the breakdown of the system. We must reorganize the debt. We have to take this $2 quadrillion, and the vast majority of it has to be simply written off. The Hamiltonian system has to function centrally, as it did in the United States. You don't have a bunch of states operating independently. You have a single national purpose, a single direction, and credit is created from the single central standpoint for the purpose of the economic policies which will actually increase the technological platform from which we're functioning. We have to create the credit for development as the BRICS nations are now doing. Here we have a situation in the world where Wall Street and bankers in the United States and in Europe are talking about billions of dollars in derivatives, trillions of dollars, quadrillions of dollars. It's all meaningless. It's all worthless. And China is talking about millions of tons or billions of tons of iron ore, of steel, and thousands of kilometers of high-speed railroad. You have just this week, China announced a 1,000-kilometer high-speed rail line from Shanghai to Guangzhou, which will reduce the time of travel from 16 hours down to 7 hours, less than 7 hours. China just announced this week, they launched the maiden voyage of the largest container ship on the planet, 19,100 TEUs. TEUs are the unit that's used to measure container ships. Bigger than anything that exists on the planet. It is so big that it does not fit through the Panama Canal. It will not fit through the revised and improved Panama Canal. It does not fit through the Suez Canal, but it will fit through the Nicaraguan Canal that the Chinese are investing in and will be ready in 5 years. Brazil, another BRICS country, has announced that it is going to increase its iron ore exports, measured in tons, not dollars, by 50% over the next 5 years. And they have purchased 35 of the largest cargo ships imaginable, 400,000 DWT, deadweight tons, to carry this out. So you have massive physical economic flows going on in one part of the planet and massive speculative cancerous flows going on in the other. That's the reality that we're facing. These two worlds cannot long coexist. And what we have to do in the United States at this point is to take advantage of this Glass-Steagall moment. We have to join with the BRICS to get the physical economy going, but most importantly, to get our entire nation back on the track of the kind of thinking that can produce the technological changes to completely revolutionize the way the entire economy is run. Why should we have container ships floating around the planet based on oil and other kinds of fuel? Why should they carry their own weight around with them and have to carry that too? That's as idiotic as having a non-electrified train, just for the same reason that we should have fusion-powered rocket ships if we're serious about exploring the solar system. We need to do this. Why should we ship petroleum from one part of the planet to the other? Mr. LaRouche has long emphasized this. A small amount, yes, but you have to go nuclear. To use petroleum as a fuel for the economy is simply unnecessary from a physical economic standpoint if we go forward in a big way with fission and then with a fusion power economy. So these are all the kinds of things that need to be done. These are the opportunities that are before us. The opening has been created. The end of the 9/11 era, post 9/11 era, is with us now. We have the opportunity to do that if we can do it and keep it.
Now, I'm happy to announce that this week LaRouche PAC has put out a new pamphlet, which is titled, Why the United States Must Join BRICS, a New International Order for Mankind. There's 20,000 print copies of this circulating, as well as a digital interactive version, which is online. And we encourage you to study this and to share it as widely as you can. Now, what this pamphlet begins with, one of 4 sections plus an appendix, which is a very, very thorough or a very important overview of Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche's role in creating the current situation that the world now faces. This pamphlet begins with an introduction, which is a short item from Mr. LaRouche. And I'd like to read a short excerpt from this, which I think encapsulates everything that we've been discussing here today. What Mr. LaRouche says in this excerpt is, what we want to do is we want to clean up our mess at home. But we also have to find out, how are we going to relate to these BRICS types of nations? How are we going to relate to Russia, to China, and to this agreement, and so forth? How are we going to take all of these large entities, which will largely dominate the planet, and include the United States as a very important element of that combination of nation states? And that's what we have to do. Therefore, we have to clean up the United States, to return it to its principle. Get rid of all this stuff, like what the present Republicans seem to be doing right now. Get rid of it. Get rid of Obama. Get rid of all that stuff. And once we do that, we simply have to reestablish the principle of the national union. Because we'll find then that what will happen is we will be a relative minority on the planet, relative to the large complexes such as in South America, what will come up in Africa eventually, what will happen in Eurasia generally, and Europe, old Europe, and so forth, will be small. The United States will be a very large entity, but not the biggest entity on the planet, politically or otherwise. And what Mr. LaRouche then proceeds to lay out is a new conception of sovereignty, which is based on a new conception of mankind. And he says that the Chinese space program is leading us to a new definition of the meaning of mankind. So I would like to invite Ben Denniston to come to the podium to discuss this.
Thanks, Matthew. To get at this, I think it's important to tie this back to some of what we opened with, and actually return to the quote that you had read, Matthew, from Leo Strauss earlier, where Strauss, as was said, the godfather of the neocons of this project for New American Century, writing to his mentor, the Nazi Carl Schmitt, when he had said that the ultimate foundation of right is the principle of the natural evil of man. Because man is, by nature, evil, and he therefore needs dominion. But dominion can be established, that is, men can be unified only in unity against other men. So this, as we discussed, was the ideology of Strauss, the ideology of Schmitt, the ideology that these guys brought to this whole neoconservative movement, this idea that man is just an evil beast, an animal, to be treated as such. But I think to get at the scale of the world shift we're now talking about and looking at, this is not just a Nazi ideology. This is not just a neocon ideology. This is, in the least, the ideology of the British Empire from its founding up to today. Much can obviously be said on this, but it's worth noting that the Nazi Carl Schmitt himself was a follower of Thomas Hobbes, one of the ideological founders of the British Empire, tying a key role in the transition from the Venetian Empire to the British Empire. And as was noted, the Nazis themselves were largely supported and products of the British Empire itself. So this is an expression of a much longer, deep-rooted, false, and degenerate view of mankind. And what we're seeing with what we're discussing, this torture policy, the Obamacare policy of the Obama administration, the preemptive war, these are all, I would say, expressions of this deeper underlying degenerate and bestial view of man as an animal. And this is something that permeates not just politics and strategy, but science, art, culture generally. This is an ideology that has defines this British system that has infected the United States and has to be uprooted for this new paradigm to work. This is what we have to overthrow. So now, as Matthew read from Mr. LaRouche has emphasized that what needs to come in now is to replace this British imperial view, this animal view of mankind. We need a real scientific, truthful conception of the nature of mankind. What makes mankind different than animals? What makes mankind a creative species on this planet and beyond? What are then the common aims and the common goals and the common objectives of mankind as a creative force on this planet? Again, what makes mankind not an animal? And I think it's worth just highlighting, as Mr. LaRouche has indicated, the work of Vladimir Vernadsky in defining the difference of man versus animal. Not just in an opinion or a statement, but a scientific, reproducible demonstration of this distinction, this unique creative capability of mankind. And obviously Mr. LaRouche's own work, I think, in taking this even further. A real scientific definition of human nature as distinct from the animals. And so, as was said, Mr. LaRouche has said that this is now being demonstrated. This principle, this higher conception of mankind is being tapped into and demonstrated with the actions of the BRICS nations and their allies, especially China, and especially, as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized, China's lunar program, which is implicitly following in the footsteps of Kepler. And I want to just underscore this because Mr. LaRouche, in discussions with him earlier today, he had added that this was a key element which we want to continue to emphasize and put on the table, that this pursuit of China in their lunar program is, whether they recognize it or not, a pursuit of the Kepler principle. And, Kepler too showed that mankind is not an animal. But Kepler also showed that mankind, even in his early days of the early 1600s, Kepler showed that mankind is not bound to the earth. Animals are bounded. Animals are bounded by their ecology, by their ecological characteristics. Animals are bounded by the planet Earth. But Kepler already, over 400 years ago, showed that mankind is implicitly not a species of Earth, that mankind is implicitly a species of the solar system, at least, in principle, if not in practice at the time. That mankind defines his own boundaries by the creative actions of the human mind, that mankind is not bound biologically by any animal characteristics, but it's the unique creative powers of the human mind, accessible to the human mind, that allows mankind to himself define and redefine his own existence. And it was Kepler that really made the solar system, at least in principle, accessible to mankind already 400 years ago. I would say Kepler laid the foundations for what Mr. LaRouche later called the transition of mankind from a species of earthlings to a species of solarians, a species of the solar system. So, to emphasize, this is what Mr. LaRouche has said is the direction in which China is going. This is where China is taking mankind with their lunar program. In a very real sense, this is the potential beginning realization of Kepler's work, of what Kepler had initially defined, at least in principle. And this is what we have to get the United States on board with, in line with, in an alliance with China, the BRICS, these various other nations, allied in this mission, in this pursuit of fulfilling Kepler's principles, so to speak, in defining this higher conception of mankind. And so I want to just conclude by actually continuing a quote from the introduction of this pamphlet, which Matthew read at the beginning, where Lynn discusses this. He says, just simply take this new arrangement, which is not a simple sovereignty. It is something new. It is not the old notion of sovereignty. It's a notion of a certain characteristic right of people to have their own government, their own system, and to have these systems of government, these new systems typified by the BRICS, to come into concert with the United States under what I've been pushing for now, and let it flow. Because we're going to find that, as is shown to us by what is being done in China in its space program, in which China has taken steps into nearby space in the direction of Johannes Kepler. We're going to find that the idea of what a human being is, as opposed to an animal, which is not clearly which is not clear generally yet, is going to change. What China is doing, especially with the space program, is going to change the way we define the meaning of mankind and a lot of other things. So just get ready to see those changes folding into the system we have today. I would say that maybe within a couple decades at least, to a couple of generations, you'll find that the idea of what mankind is, what sovereignty is, and so forth, is going to go through a revolutionary change. But it will be a peaceful revolutionary change and a profitable one. So we have to proceed step by step to march in that direction to reach the goals which that direction points out. So I think that defines a clear, subsuming challenge facing the United States today, and not just shifting this or that policy, but getting at this root issue of this much longer standing British imperial doctrine and pursuing what Mr. LaRouche has defined as the Kepler principle for mankind's true nature in the solar system.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you, Dennis, for joining me tonight. And I would like to bring a conclusion to our webcast here. Thank you for tuning in, and please stay tuned to LaRouchepack.com.